Hi everyone, Jeff Alex here, your host of the Living Well with MS podcast. To all our listeners, I hope you and your families are staying safe and healthy during this COVID-19 crisis. While social distancing and other restrictions may seem like a drag, in the long run they will prove critical to stemming the tide of this epidemic and returning to a sense of normality. I have faith we'll come out of this stronger, smarter and a bit more enlightened as a result. In the meantime, we at Overcoming MS and the whole team behind this podcast are here for you to keep you informed and help you keep on track with your personal journey to a healthier you. Now, on with the show. In this episode of the Living Well with MS podcast, we're joined by Helen Rees Leahy. Helen was diagnosed with primary progressive MS in 1997 when she was 37 years old. Being ineligible for any disease-modifying treatment within the UK National Health Service, she began to explore holistic approaches to managing her condition. She discovered OMS in 2008 and has followed the programme ever since. Helen lives in Conwy, a small medieval town in North Wales. In 2017 she took medical retirement from the University of Manchester, where she was a professor in the Department of Art History and Cultural Practice. As an emerita professor, Helen continues to research and teach doctoral students. She also spends time hand weaving and learning Welsh, the language of her ancestors. Helen has never taken medication for her MS and is committed to living well through active self-care. Welcome to the programme, Helen. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, what you do, family and just background?
Hi Jeff, and thank you for having me on the podcast. Yes, I'm 60 years old. I live in Conwy, which is a small medieval town in North Wales. I moved here about 3 years ago when I took medical retirement from my job. Before that, I was a professor in the Department of Art History at the University of Manchester. So I worked as an academic. I was researching and teaching art history, and I also set up a program to train people, a master's program to train people as museum curators. I'd worked as a museum curator myself for many years before I became an academic. So I had sort of quite a busy working life before I retired. I moved to Wales. It's part of the country, part of the UK that both my husband and I love very much. And in fact, my father's family was not only Welsh, but Welsh speaking. And so for me, in a way, it's a bit of a sort of coming home, I guess, being here. But my husband, he's actually a hospital doctor himself. He's an oncologist, and he still works. So he spends the weeks in Manchester, comes here at the weekends. But in fact, he's going to retire later this year. So he'll come and live here full time then as well.
It's a lovely part of the world.
It's a beautiful part of the world, yes.
My father lived in Llanfyddechan, which is not very far from you.
Fantastic. No, very close. Beautiful place.
Just to understand a bit about your MS journey, when were you diagnosed, a bit about your MS and how you handled your initial diagnosis?
I was diagnosed with primary progressive MS in 1997. So I've been living with that diagnosis for about 23 years now. But like a lot of people, I do believe I had MS really for a few years before I was eventually diagnosed. I found I was beginning to experience foot drop, which, as you know, is a very familiar symptom of MS. I was getting it, after I'd walked for about a mile or so. And I went to our family doctor to ask what it might be. I had vague suspicion it could be something like MS, but he was quite dismissive of that, and in fact referred me to the orthopaedic department of the Royal Infirmary in Manchester. And not surprisingly, they couldn't really find anything that was the matter with me because it wasn't an orthopaedic problem. So they in fact wanted to discharge me, and it was thanks to my husband. I think doctors find it difficult to resist other doctors asking them to do things. My husband persuaded them to refer me to the neurology department, for further investigations. So after a fairly long wait, I had an MRI scan. I had a lumbar puncture. So about a year later, I was finally diagnosed with MS. In many ways, I think that diagnosis after that sort of fairly protracted period of time before it, I think it was quite a relief in some ways, because at last I could actually kind of, name the problem and I suppose rethink how I wanted to be a person with MS and what this meant for my life. But I have to say that the doctor who gave me the diagnosis offered me very little. I mean, offered me nothing, essentially. In fact, the way he gave me the information was very perfunctory. He gave me very little sort of broader information about what this might mean. There was no treatment available. I certainly wasn't offered any mental health support, and certainly there was no lifestyle advice, anything that I might do myself to manage my condition. So, he sent me off and he said he'd see me again in a year or so's time. So I think at that time I did feel quite alone, apart from the support of my husband and some sort of close friends. And to be honest, that attitude, or my experience, I should say, of the NHS hasn't changed hugely, I have to say, over the last 20 years. There isn't any medication available for people through the NHS up until fairly recently, people with primary progressive MS, my kind of MS, and I think if a doctor hasn't got any sort of disease-modifying therapy to offer a patient, I'm sure it's frustrating for them. But as I say, my experience has been sort of very, very limited in terms of the support I've been given from the health service. And although now, there's an increasing amount of research into primary progressive MS and new treatments like Ocrevus are becoming available, I think I am now too old and too disabled to be eligible for any of those treatments.
And could you just briefly explain the difference with primary progressive MS for people who are new on their journey and maybe don't understand the differences?
Yes. Absolutely. So primary progressive MS is the kind of MS where you have your first symptom is sorry, I'll start again, Jeff. Primary progressive MS is progressive from the first symptom. So I've never had relapses, but instead it's more of a sort of gradual, in my case, fairly slow sort of worsening of symptoms over time. And I think the pace of progression varies from person to person. So there's no very predictable trajectory for primary progressive MS any more than there is for relapsing remitting. The statistics are that only about 10 to 15% of people with a diagnosis of MS are diagnosed as having primary progressive MS. So we are a minority, but as you know very well, sometimes people with relapsing remitting MS develop secondary progressive MS, which is a bit more like primary progressive MS. And I think we also know from our own experience and other people's experience that, sometimes these distinctions are not actually terribly useful, that people can experience relapses and progression, maybe. So it's quite a complex picture, I think. But as I say, the idea of primary progressive is not so much a kind of relapse followed by remission, but a sort of steadier progression throughout the course of one's life.
And just to sort of clarify with that, the difference with primary and secondary progressive is primary you start with, at secondary you start with relapse remitting and then it goes on to become secondary, but ultimately they're both progressive. So when did you discover OMS? and decided to follow the program?
So because I'm so old, I was
You're not that old.
I was diagnosed with MS a couple of years before, George Jelinek, the guy who founded OMS, himself was diagnosed with the condition. So, my diagnosis predates the creation of OMS. And I think it's kind of important. I mean, just personally, I always feel it's quite important just to recognize that, because I think today, we certainly say to people, the sooner you start on a program like OMS after your diagnosis, the better. But it didn't exist when I was first diagnosed, and of course, Dr. Google didn't exist either. So getting hold of the sort of wealth, perhaps the overabundance of information that's available for people today wasn't a possibility or an issue back in the sort of late 1990s. But I had always sort of understood the importance of taking control of my sort of physical and mental health and well-being. I grew up in the 1970s. I was very sort of engaged in the women's movement as a young woman. And at that time, the women's health movement very much advocated, our own kind of taking control of our personal health and not being over-reliant on conventional medicine. And again, I think the writer Judy Graham published a book, I think it was in 2000, which was called MS. I think it was a self-help guide to its management. And I don't think Judy Graham had a great sort of deal of scientific research to provide an evidence base for what she was arguing in the book. But on an anecdotal, on a personal, on a common sense level, it made a huge amount of sense to me. So I began to do some of the things that she was advocating, taking evening primrose oil, doing meditation, doing sort of gentle exercise. And then I think, I can't quite remember when, but quite soon after that, I did read George Jelinek's first book, which I think was published around the same time, and was a sort of precursor to the more developed OMS program with all of its, scientific research evidence base that we know and follow today. So I think sort of in the early 2000s, I was probably following a sort of mishmash of Judy Graham, George Jelinek, and my own sort of instincts about what was good for me. I did a meditation course. I began to take vitamin D and so on. So I think it wasn't really until about, I don't know, sort of the late 2010s, or 2000s, 2008, 2010, that I probably began to follow OMS more systematically. I think that was around the time that the website was created and the second book was published. So I think that was the time when I felt there was perhaps a more sort of explicit toolkit available.
And did your husband sort of follow with the evidence base, being from a medical background?
Good question. So I think my husband is a very strong advocate of holistic approaches to health and disease management. He's an oncologist. He treats cancer patients. Often he has a pharmaceutical intervention which can be very effective for those patients. But of course, not always. People come to a point where chemotherapy actually, it will not necessarily prolong their life, let alone prolong the quality or enhance the quality of their life. And I think Michael, my husband, has always worked within that space and himself has developed holistic interventions for his patients, which are very similar to the principles of OMS. So taking control of one's own management of one's own health, eating well, not smoking, exercise, stress reduction, these are very familiar interventions to us. So he was always very, very supportive of what I was doing, and has really been, a sort of a strong and a brilliant supporter along the way of all this. He really gets it.
That's excellent. And so the OMS program, it's certainly, George Jelinek had relapse remitting MS. It's certainly the majority of people involved in the background in terms of whether it's mindfulness, whether it's exercise, are people from a more relapse remitting background. But how does the program fit into the realities of someone with progressive MS?
Well, without OMS, I would not have had any kind of sustainable health management plan, because, as I say, I have never been eligible for any disease modifying treatments within the NHS in the UK. Access even to things like physiotherapy has been very stop-start. I did have quite regular physio for a while, and then the budgets were cut at the hospital, and that came to an end. I was trying to access hydrotherapy in Manchester for over 10 years, and could never find that. So OMS has really filled that gap, and I would strongly recommend it to people with PPMS just as much as to people with any other form of MS. And I think the key thing for me is this concept of living well with MS. It's what I need to take care of myself, and I don't fight my MS. I really don't like that kind of sort of belligerent language which sometimes is used around the experience of illness or disease. I'm not at war with my own body, and I think OMS implicitly teaches us how to accept and to live with and to manage our conditions, our lives, such as they are. And I think meditation and other forms of stress reduction, mindfulness practice also helps teach us kind of self-compassion. And I think these are really, really vital tools actually for living well with any kind of chronic condition. So yes, OMS has taught me a huge amount, and lessons that I'm very pleased to have learned. And I don't think I'd necessarily have encountered or led my life in this particular way if I hadn't had MS. I'm not suggesting, if I had my time again, I would definitely want to have MS. But it's a question, and I've certainly gained from it as well as lost from it, and certain things I mourn and I grieve for, but other things have I've, as I say, have been a real gain.
And are there specific obstacles to following the OMS program for someone who's got primary progressive MS?
I think there are. As you say yourself, given that we are a minority, and inevitably the sort of the dominant conversation and language relates perhaps more explicitly to people with relapsing remitting MS, people with primary progressive and perhaps other forms of MS, there's a danger that we don't necessarily see or hear ourselves in the program, and that I think completely unintentionally, we can feel a little bit marginalized within the program, and the ideas that are kind of promulgated in the program. I think, for example, before just thinking about what we were going to talk about this morning, yesterday I had a look at the OMS website, and to be honest, I could not see any pictures of people like myself on the website. There were, perhaps they're in there somewhere, but just as a quick look, I couldn't see any photographs, any images of people using a walking stick or cane for walking, and I couldn't see any pictures of people in a wheelchair, for example. And I completely get it that, OMS is about uplifting people, it's about being positive, it's about being inspiring, but I would question whether, the only, or the sort of the default inspiring image is of a kind of 30-something person, walking barefoot on the beach or kind of running a half marathon. I think my life is positive and inspiring, and that isn't me. So I think that a charity like OMS has a very big challenge in this regard, because the MS community is very, very diverse, and I think it is a challenge to be as inclusive as we would all like it to be. So I guess it's I don't mean to sound particularly critical. I think these things are sort of partly inevitable, but I think OMS can and should reflect that diversity of its community a bit more clearly. And I also think, there's a bit of a danger with a program like OMS, which stresses recovery, which talks about positive change. So even on the podcast, sometimes speakers have talked about the prospect of using a wheelchair as being something that to be kind of avoided at all costs, almost as if being in a wheelchair is a kind of failure, as if those of us who use a wheelchair being a bit too much cheese in secret. And I think again, I would really want to just draw attention to that, because I think we all experience disease progression in different ways and at different speeds. There isn't any good or bad, failure or success in this, and life isn't necessarily diminished because we aren't as physically able or active as we once were. So I think those kind of messages do need to be kind of questioned and perhaps explored a bit more than they are. And I think, I say, this kind of notion of recovery, I will never recover in the sense of being cured, no more than anybody else with MS will. So for me, as I say, it's been much more useful to think about OMS in terms of living well, in terms of sort of healing as a continuous process, rather than sort of recovery as a kind of binary between sort of being well or not well.
And you can live a good life in a wheelchair.
Of course you can.
It's not. I mean, I've certainly. I don't know where the phrase came from, and I think and it may have been mentioned on a podcast. I think it probably was that, and it was something very early on in my journey that was with OMS that was mentioned to me, that someone said that the cheese aisle makes them think of wheelchairs, and there's two parts to that. There's one part where actually it's stuck in my mind, and it was okay that it was a visual representation of, if you carry on with the way that I carried on with my lifestyle, which was that I was very active and very, very fit, but I had horrific, my diet was terrible, mindfulness non-existent. I was doing, apart from doing lots of exercise, I was doing everything else terribly wrong. And it did give a very quick visual, okay, there's different paths I can go down, and actually cheese isn't that important to me. And staying as active and fit as I can is very important to me. So that worked. But then on the other aspects, absolutely. Now that I know, there's certainly lots of people involved in the MS community who have amazing lives, and some of them, like for a whole spectrum. Now, I've met people who are regular marathon runners who've got MS, through to wheelchair rugby players and people who use walkers, canes in between. And there is a commonality in the people I've met, is that they're all very positive and are having a very fulfilling life. So there is definitely two aspects to it, I think. And I can completely see what you're saying about like a charity like OMS. On the one hand, the message on the website, if there's a newly diagnosed person, which we were saying like 90% of people have got relapse remitting MS, so that they say a 25, your atypical person, maybe 25-year-old female with relapse remitting MS, and she goes on there and she's in a terribly despondent state and then sees lots of positivity, that could be a good thing. But then what about the 10% of people who that's not their situation, and what they want is something positive, and actually there's a person who is in a wheelchair but actually is having a very enjoyable life, and there's a definite trade-off in there, and I don't know how you square that circle.
I think there's a trade-off. It's ableism.
Yeah.
End of. To talk about people in wheelchairs, talk about people in a wheelchair, but they have a good life. Even that is ableist language. They're in a wheelchair and they have a good life.
Mm-hmm.
Running a marathon, playing wheelchair rugby, just being able to, conform to a certain kind of orthodoxy of fitness. That isn't the only way to lead a good life. There are many, many ways of leading a good life. And I think, we need to recognise ableist language for what it is. And nobody should take heart from, whether or not, you're still kind of young and active with MS. Nobody should take heart from ableist language around the subject at all. And I feel that really, really strongly.
No, I do. I'm definitely guilty of that. It's a difficult thing to, if you're not in. You become more conscious of it, having a critical illness, but still there's so many different aspects. And no, I certainly, and I would definitely put my hand up and say I'm definitely guilty of that, and in an unconscious way. But
we don't tolerate racism or homophobia or
misogyny
in our conversations. And I think as a health charity, we all of us, I'm not suggesting I get it right every time, far from it, but I think we all need to be very conscious of the power of words and images. And as I say, I think we really need to recognise and call out ableism for what it is. And then we can move on, and then we can move on without these distinctions between, one group of people who are running marathons and another group of people, who might be writing amazing books or, cooking extraordinary meals or making beautiful gardens, or they happen to be in a wheelchair.
Yeah. No, completely agree. I mean, in just to take it to a completely different context, it's almost similar to someone who's Japanese being racist against someone who's an Inuit. That it's still racism. You can't just categorize. It's like, it only affects Black Americans. It doesn't. It's as soon as you have distinctions, then you're having distinctions. So the fact that the majority, if let's say 90% of people who relapse remitting MS, yes, there's issues that they have. They shouldn't just look at their own issues. They really should be looking at everyone's issues. It affects, it could be someone with something completely different, with nothing to do with MS. But once we start having thoughts and restrictions and all these things put in place with people's abilities, then it becomes a problem.
I think the two most important things that I would say, and they're in a way they're sort of very, very simple things. One, none of us knows what the future holds. So, who knows where any of us will be, health-wise, in a year's time, a month's time, a week's time, a decade's time. We don't know. All we can do is look after ourselves absolutely the very best we can today, tomorrow, the next day. And the second point is it's never too late to do that. So, even though, you might have had MS for many years, your disease might not have progressed to a particular condition. I strongly believe it's never too late to start. It's never too late to start, taking care of yourself, prioritizing your health, and, taking control to whatever degree, is possible of the management of your health. So those are the key things. It's we none of us have a crystal ball to see the future, but we can all grasp, what OMS can offer us today, and that's the most powerful thing.
And as someone with primary progressive MS, how do you measure your progress? So do you look to say, okay, how would that be? I mean, obviously it's not a lack of relapses. So how would you measure your progress with OMS or just with your OMS in general?
It's a really good question, and it's kind of impossible to answer that, because often people say to me, friends of mine who know that I've followed this program, they don't really understand quite what it is, but they kind of know that I'm doing something, and they say to me, have you got better as a result? Or I ask myself, would my health be worse now if I hadn't followed the program, for the last, I don't know, say 10 years or so? I think, I don't know the answer because I haven't conducted a kind of controlled experiment on myself, obviously. I believe my health might well be worse than it is. But so in a sense, I don't find that a very useful question to ask myself, because, as I say, it's unanswerable. I think the way I measure it is how effective, how good do I feel in terms of being able to manage and to take control of my condition and of my life on a day-to-day basis, if that makes sense. So, I feel I'm succeeding with the program when I feel I'm in charge. I'm enjoying my life. The things that I do to take care of myself, feel good. I can feel the sort of the daily benefits of those interventions, as opposed to not feeling I'm in control and things becoming difficult to cope with. So I guess I find it easier to measure progress on a kind of micro, on a kind of day-to-day level, than I do on a sort of broader view of progression overall. And I think probably a lot of people who are doing the OMS program or looking after themselves in different ways, I think we all know that if we don't get active, we don't keep active, we get stiff and we can do less. If we, overeat or eat kind of junk food, that never feels good inside our systems. We know that although sometimes, it might be tempting not to do something or to do something that is not good for us. We know that, in the short term as well as the long term, we experience, we don't get a good experience from that. So as I say, I think it's much easier with for me to think about these things on quite a small scale rather than on a big scale. And in terms of the bigger picture, I guess I just kind of go forward with, faith that I'm doing kind of belief that I'm doing something which is good, and whatever the future holds, well, that will become clear when the time comes.
And there's one thing I wanted to bring up. You've written a blog article about weaving, and I found it quite fascinating, having never been involved in weaving at all. But I just wanted to ask you a bit about that and about how that sort of integrates with your lifestyle and affects you.
So when I retired, as I say, a few years ago now, I really began to think seriously about how to enjoy myself, which might sound a slightly trite thing to say, but I think, when you've had a very demanding job and, you lead much of your working life with a kind of attitude of responsibility that relates to work and relates to other aspects of your life, how to lead a good life when you've actually you've let go of some of those responsibilities. And for me, having a creative practice is really an important part of that mix. So I've always been interested in design and art history professionally, and wanted to find a way of making that would be fun, that would be involved learning, and would be creatively fulfilling. And I kind of was attracted to this idea of weaving cloth. And after sort of a few misstarts, I bought myself a loom. It's a small floor-based loom. It sits here in my work room, in my house, and I always have some weaving on the loom. And I know some days I might weave for 4 or 5 hours. Other days I might weave for 5 minutes. But the beauty of it is, it's a creative practice that you can do a small amount of, you can do a large amount of. It's a form of free weaving that I do. So it's very creative. I start out with a design in my head, but often as the piece develops, I deviate from that, or I have a better idea, or it ends up looking rather different than how I'd anticipated at the outset. And I find it both relaxing. There's a lot of research into practices like knitting and weaving and pottery, which show that this kind of repetitive, sort of rhythmic work with our hands is actually very, very good for our minds. That it can be quite soothing, it can be quite calming. So it requires concentration, it requires attention, but it's a very kind of unstressful form of attention. I mean, occasionally when something goes horribly wrong, then yes, it's frustrating like anything else. But by and large, when the weaving goes well, it is relaxing. But it's a little bit more than just relaxing. It's very purposive, and of course, it's very pleasurable when something rather nice emerges on the loom. So I think what I'm saying will be familiar to anybody who has a practice like this, whether it's weaving or sewing or making pottery or woodwork or painting or gardening. But for me, it's a real sort of mind-body connection, which fits into the OMS philosophy really, really clearly as well.
I do. I mean, I think it's very mindful, and I think that if people are interested in that sort of thing, that you can almost think of a very broad range of things. I mean, I was just sitting next to me now is my guitar, and I think it just occurred to me. I thought, well, actually, that's, although it's very, very different to weaving, it's still that element of it's physical and mental and creative. And it was just when you were saying sometimes it goes horribly wrong. I'm a terrible guitar player, to be honest. But yeah, sometimes it goes right, and you have a recognisable song come out of it, and sometimes it goes horribly wrong. But it's that, you're concentrating and you're creating something, and so it's very, very different. But I think there's so many different things it could be, whether it be, as you say, gardening or weaving or playing guitar. They all have that similarity in a way, although they're so different from each other.
They do, and they also have they're an expression of kind of hope in the future, or hope that there will be a future as well. So, when you're practicing your guitar, well, that's pleasurable in itself, but also you know that the more you play your guitar, the better you get, and you kind of move on and doing something a bit more, involved than the previous, piece you're working on, and so forth. And if you plant a garden, if you plant a seed, you do that with the anticipation that the seed will emerge and grow into the plant, and all being well, you'll be there to see it. And it's the same when you make something, when you make a piece of cloth, or you knit something. So I think these activities, they seem very simple, and it's easy to dismiss them in our lives, isn't it? It's easy to sort of be slightly sort of self-deprecating when we talk about these things. But actually, I think they're very profound. And I think, they're profound because they have that significance for us in the process, in the moment. But they also, as I say, they express something about our hope in the future as well.
And just as a final question, as someone with primary progressive MS, could you share with other people that have primary progressive MS what motivates or inspires you?
One thing I have found very useful as somebody with primary progressive MS is a physical practice that I was introduced to by a really brilliant neurophysiotherapist in Manchester. She's called Anne Robertson. She's retired now, and she is a qualified Feldenkrais teacher, and she taught me the Feldenkrais method, both when I was part of the having physio with the NHS in Manchester, and I've also worked with her subsequently. And I think the Feldenkrais method is a really interesting one for people who don't have a huge amount of physical capacity. It's a very slow and gentle form of somatic education. You do a session, it might, a lesson as it's called, that might be 20 minutes, it might be 40 minutes. You can be lying down, you could be sitting in a chair. And the idea is that you explore sometimes very small, slow and gentle movements, but you pay great attention to a very specific movement. And it might not sound a great deal, but actually what you're doing in that process is you're opening up new kind of neural pathways. You're actually, it's this idea of neuroplasticity, which is much discussed in the OMS conversation, that we can retrain our brains to improve physical capacity, along with so many other things. And of course, one way of doing that is to go out on a bike ride, or to kind of go swimming, or ride a horse, or go for a run. But for people who can't do those things because they don't have those capacities, the great lesson I've learned from doing Feldenkrais is that actually, doing something very small and working with the breath, it can also be a very, very powerful way of really bringing us back into our bodies. I think, when you are disabled, you can feel very estranged from your body. You can feel quite alienated from it at times, and for all sorts of reasons. And Feldenkrais, as I say, is a very gentle form of practice, which brings us back into our bodies in the same way as people who talk about meditation and mindfulness on the OMS website and the blogs and guided meditations and so forth would talk about kind of coming back into our bodies through the breath. So that for me. It's not a well-known practice in this country, in the UK. It's much better known actually elsewhere. I mean, I think in Germany, Feldenkrais lessons are available, on through their health system. It's a recognised physical therapy. But there are Feldenkrais teachers all over the world, in America, in Australia, places where OMS thrives and flourishes as well. And it's a very rigorous training that they have to do. It's not some kind of, thing you just kind of go and do for a weekend and then you begin teaching it. I think that the training actually, takes place over a number of years. So I found that immensely useful. And, I know I can sometimes sound quite sort of critical of some of the assumptions that people make within the in the MS community, within even the OMS community. So just one thing I'd also like to quickly say is, although I can find, I find OMS quite challenging. I find it immensely rewarding, but it can also be quite challenging. And just to give you one example of that, so I've been sort of both been inspired and challenged simultaneously. During the lockdown, we had a brilliant series of webinars from OMS, which were organised to give us, and I thought they were fantastic, great support during the lockdowns. Many of us were living through in our different places and countries around the world, and they were on different themes, as you'll well remember. And there was one on exercise with Veronique Gautier-Simmons. And, Veronique is an amazing woman. She's a great athlete. She's kind of incredibly, she really understands the benefits of exercise and is a powerful advocate for them. And I was watching the webinar and listening to it, beginning to feel a bit sort of grumpy, thinking, oh, this is fine, if you can do all these things, but I can't. And I thought to myself, well, that's not really good enough. I need to, instead of just being grumpy about it, I really need to kind of embrace this conversation. And I was very aware that during lockdown, I was living just by myself, because obviously my husband was working in the hospital in Manchester, hadn't seen him for months. And I wasn't really going outside of my own garden. So I thought, what can I do which is going to get me exercising more actively than I do at the moment? So I've ordered an electric tricycle, which is being built for me with adaptations for my capacities. So it will have a few things that are modified to suit me. And the idea is that having a trike rather than a bike means I don't have to worry about balance getting on and off it. And having the electric motor means obviously I can pedal as much as I can or I want to. And then when I'm too tired or I can't pedal anymore, the motor will help me to get home. So I've taken that very specific action directly, I would say, in response to the OMS webinar. And at the start of the webinar, I could not have predicted that I was going to do something like that. So I think it's really good to be challenged. And I pick up the tricycle next month, so I don't know how it's going to be, but I'll let you know how I get on with it.
And with that, thank you very much for joining us on the Living Well with MS podcast. It's been fascinating.
Thank you very much for having me, Jeff.
With that, I would like to thank you all for listening to this episode of Living Well with MS. Remember that there is a wealth of information at overcomingms.org, including show notes and an archive of all Living Well with MS episodes. Once again, that's overcomingms.org. There you can also find OMS-friendly recipes and exercise tips, connect with other OMSers in your local area through our OMS Circles programme, and learn about the latest research going on in the MS world generally and related to OMS specifically. I encourage you to register on the site and stay informed about the latest news and updates. I also encourage you to subscribe to this podcast so you never miss an episode. And please feel free to share it with others who might find it of value. Let us know what you think about the podcast by leaving a review, and if you have ideas for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you, so please contact us via our website overcomingms.org. Thanks again for listening and for joining me on this journey to overcoming MS and living well with multiple sclerosis. I'm Jeff Alex, and I'll see you next time.